Hello and good afternoon, everyone. We're basically back on track. Next Friday is the quiz. This lecture's material is not on the quiz. The original plan was to get to the Civil War before the quiz, but that didn't happen. So I'm not going to talk about, just to avoid confusion about the material, in Chapter 5, we will talk about the Civil War, but we're just going to delay that, so you don't have to study anything from Chapter 5. So I'm just going to, instead of talking about the Civil War, this lecture, I'm going to start at the beginning of Chapter 5, so there's a clear line. The things that are in the book about slavery and the triangle trade, that you have to read, and there may be a couple questions on that on the test, so you have to be ready for it. But we'll talk more. Slavery doesn't go away just because there's a civil war, and it's the main reason for the Civil War. So we'll come back and talk in more detail about that and its effects on American people right up to the present. For now, though, we're going to talk about imperialism, the greatest empire that has ever existed. The greatest empire so far was the British Empire. It depends on how you measure it, I suppose, but in terms of size and proportion of economic power and surface area of the globe, population, by any of those measures, the British Empire was the largest. But there have been many empires throughout history. The Mongolian Empire, Russia had an enormous empire too. The Spanish Empire preceded the British one just by a century or two. Some people assume that when the British lost the War of American Independence, the American Revolutionary War, that was, well, it was a bad thing, of course. It was a loss of territory and power and influence in that area, but it's really after that, after America becomes detached from the British Empire, and they continue to trade with each other, and although they fight off and on, they continue to have a pretty close relationship diplomatically, even militarily, but especially in terms of trade. So it's not surprising that now, these days, that the United Kingdom and the United States get along very well, even though several hundred years ago they fought a bitter war to try and keep the Americans from seceding. So the imperial project in England didn't start as quickly as people think. It's not like the Spanish expanded all over the world with the Portuguese, and then there was the Armada, and Queen Elizabeth came along and said, I think I have a good idea. Let's try and make our own colonies in America. And then, Sir Walter Raleigh tried to do that, and they formed the Virginia Company, and things just took off from there. It was it was an idea that goes back far into the Middle Ages, all the way back to our friend Henry II. Henry II is credited with subduing the Irish clans. During his reign, he fought some battles in Ireland and basically didn't colonize, but sort of annexed part of Ireland for the purposes of the English. So ever since the 12th century, there's been English, I think the Irish would probably say, interference or control with their kingdom, Ireland was more like kingdoms and clans, just like England was before it got unified. Ireland never really managed to unify itself under one leader. Otherwise, some of these things never would have happened. But there was always conflict between Irish clans and thanes and kings and princes, and the English took advantage of this, as they did in the case of the North American natives. as the Romans did in the case of the Celtics when they invaded. All the Celtics were fighting each other, had their own alliances, and the Romans joined one group, and with their help, they defeated the other ones. The Spanish did it in Mexico, and the Spanish did it in Peru. Franco Pizarro did that, Francisco Pizarro. So it happened many times over the last 1,000 years or so, that European invaders, conquerors, explorers, conquistadors, they came to a new area which already had its own power structure, and they made alliances with whichever group they could persuade to fight with them, and then upset the balance of power in the region, cleared out all the enemies of their ally, and then basically took all the land from their ally too, backstabbed their allies afterwards, leaving everybody who cooperated with them with basically nothing. So this is the always the danger with dealing with foreign people who promise you things and promise to help you solve all your problems, and then once your problems are gone, you have a bigger problem. The British are still there, or the Romans are still there, or the Spanish are still there, and they're a little bit more difficult to handle than the tribes or clans or fellow countrymen that you were fighting to begin with. So why do we do this? The Romans were very clever, and they would say that Rome built an empire in self-defense, right? Often neighboring tribes or countries or people would invade Rome, and then they would do battle and defend their territory, and they would always retaliate. Their idea was that every war they fought had to have a reason. It's called casus belli, and there has to be a just war. And the justification for the Romans was fine originally, because another people would try to destroy them, and then in retaliation they would attack them back, and then they would destroy the other kingdom and take it under their control. However, as the Romans got larger and larger, they started to argue that we need to attack them first. We can't wait for them to attack. We have to take the initiative, and that is casus belli, which is a stretch, really, to say that, well, there's a kingdom there that's big and powerful, and if we let it sit there, someday it's going to attack us, so we better attack it first. This is not what's happening with the British. The British are on an island, and they are getting attacked periodically from various directions, as we've studied, but they conclude that the only way to protect themselves completely is to also control the water. Eventually, it's going to be called a blue water strategy, where England they believe they have to have the strongest navy, and that's the only way that they can be protected from foreign invasion, because that's the direction that the invasions always come from. Excuse me. So whenever really an English army is attacking somebody else, they're going outside their geographical borders, because they have a natural border. They are an island, so the edge of their land. With Scotland, they share a land border, so you can have a different opinion about that. But whenever they're going over water, even to Europe, they're crossing a kind of boundary zone that's a natural edge to their territory. But they start to believe that that's not enough. Henry VIII declares that England is an empire before he makes himself the head of the church. And he does that. Excuse me, let me blow my nose again for a second. The reason that he does that is because if you have imperium over a territory, it means there's an absolute authority in your territory. So in Henry VIII's case, he didn't want the Pope telling the English to do one thing, and him telling them to do another, and then feeling like they had to obey the Pope because religion was more important to them. So they would do something that the Pope told them to do, which was against what the king's decree or law or orders were. So once he got this imperium passed through Parliament, and he became the absolute authority of everything, the highest power in the land, he got complete dominion over England. Imperium that's what it means. The Romans used it in that way. So all these other territories, they are going to become part of the empire one by one. But it really starts with just England is an empire itself, and they have control over Ireland. And then they start to gain more control over Scotland until they unify with Scotland, and Scotland and England together are the United Kingdom, and they have imperium together, have imperium over all the other territories. Okay, so in the book, there's a detailed list there of the things that people would perceive if you're an imperialist, the arguments that you would make. Arguments that you would make to justify building an empire. So that's on page 152 and 153. So I don't think I need to read all of them. I have a terrible cold still, I'm sorry. I'm trying to get through this without interrupting. The benefits and the demerits of empire, I've written it up here. I'm not going to write them all down on the board because they're clearly stated in the book. There's 6 of them on each side. Please remember to read these carefully, because this is not for this quiz, but for the last quiz and for the final. You should know all these points, okay? So one of the biggest benefits, people always come back to this, is Spain and especially England, but the Dutch also and the Portuguese too, through trading, through creating these far-flung, they're not really colonies yet, they're just kind of trading posts and stopping points and resource extraction, places. Through the creation of these things, they've basically made these kind of connections that go around the entire earth. So trade can occur from the Philippines to Africa to Northern Europe to South America and North America, and they've created this system that is the really, really basic version of what we have, right? All the equipment, everything's slower, everything's being done with different technology and with different planning, and in fact, even the objects aren't exactly the same. What they're trying to accomplish, in some cases, people are just trying to make money, but after a while, sometimes people are trying to create an actual, physical empire by removing people and settling areas and creating new places. If you look at New York City and America, obviously now you will see a very different country than when you walk down the street in London. But early New York and early Boston, Philadelphia, those cities were built to look like English cities. We were trying to recreate a New England. That's why it's called New England, and that's why it's called New France. I totally recommend going to Montreal in Canada. I lived there for 3.5 years. And one of the best things about Montreal is to go to what they called Old Montreal. There's just a kind of a neighborhood down by the river, which they have cobblestones and old-fashioned buildings and narrow streets, and you can go for a horse and buggy ride, and you can buy Montreal bagels, which are the best bagels in the world. lots of good food. It's a little bit expensive, but they even have a Notre Dame cathedral, right? It's smaller than the real one in France, but it's still amazing and it's huge. I've never been to the real one, so it's got the same blocky Gothic style and everything, all the decorations and the style of the real one, just not quite as large, but it's a sort of recreation of France. So that colonization thing, that's not necessarily doesn't necessarily have to happen when you build an empire, but often that's a possibility, especially when, as I said, the area where the English settled, the disease that the Spanish had brought to Mexico, and all the way up to Texas and the interior of North America, those diseases had already spread and killed many people. So when the English arrived, there wasn't that many people there. It wasn't like they were attacking, burning down huge cities and capturing kings and emperors like what happened in Mexico with the Aztecs. Many of the people had already died, abandoned the villages, or were not numerous enough to resist. So in the textbook you can see global period of peace. This is sort of, now we're leaping ahead a little bit, but France and England will continue to fight until Napoleon finally loses at Waterloo, and then France has to take a break from trying to take over the world and being a superpower for a while, although they recover very, very quickly. But from about Napoleon in 1815 to 1914, at the beginning of World War One, there's no serious challenge to the British Empire's control of the ocean. So this enables piracy isn't really possible, or it's extremely risky now that there's so many ships out there, and they're under the protection of the British Navy. So you've got global peace with no major wars, like I said, from Napoleon up until World War One. You're supposed to be getting protection by the Royal Navy and British soldiers. The sea lanes are open and protected from pirates. There's technology and science and education and philosophy that's being shared. And of course, learning the art, literature, and as they claim, a more sophisticated, I'm not saying that's true, a more sophisticated civilization being introduced to that. I just watched a movie in one of my classes called A Passage to India. I think you may end up watching it if you decide to take the post-colonial class when you're in undergrad. And it's a pretty interesting perspective on what it feels like to be the colonized versus the colonizer. Of course, most of us would lean towards the bad points of empire. We know now about what the purpose of empire is: to dominate, control, to extract resources, and to support the metropole, so support the home country. It's not for the benefit of the territory, it's for the benefit of the dominant nation or kingdom or empire. So they appropriate local resources and taxes to make taxes on goods. There's a foreign government controlling your state. You don't have self-determination or sovereignty. There's a lack of political representation, so you don't have any seats. This is what Benjamin Franklin and no taxation without representation means is, if you're going to tax us, then you actually need to let us represent ourselves so we can have a say on how the taxes are used. There's a lack of recognition of the value of importance of culture and art and music that are not British. It takes a long time for the Americans even to get respected by the British, let alone African countries or countries in India. Okay. All right, so the following page in the book, everybody's got a cold these days. I don't know who's giving it to everyone, but it's just going around and around. Ireland, there's only a single page there. As I said, my last name is Sullivan, so I've got to do something about this because some of my ancestors are Irish. Ireland was one of the most notorious victims of the British. One, because it was really their first sort of colony project. And like I said, it started 800 years ago with Henry II coming to help an Irish leader fight against another Irish one. And then when they defeated the other Irish person, he left people and soldiers behind. So Northern Ireland especially, Dublin is sort of originally a Viking influenced city. So you've got, in Northern Ireland, you've got the place where English, Irish, sometimes Vikings, Danish, and Scottish Protestants arrive later too. So you've got in the West and the South, you've got Irish people just not purely Irish, but culturally more Irish, and still speaking Irish languages and doing things with Irish customs. And then there's an area called the Pale, which is it's roughly the area around Belfast, which is Northern Ireland now. And this is the reason why Ireland isn't one country still, is because for hundreds and hundreds of years, that was the place where everybody mixed. Dublin, of course, was the bigger city, but largely the Irish always had control of Dublin. But Belfast was the second largest city, and around that area, there were plantations, and we talked about plantations being places where slaves worked, but you also have like people being planted there, Protestants or Scottish or English. And so you've got a mix of, you've got Anglo-Irish and you've got Scots-Irish and you've got Scots-Norman, and it's a very mixed ethnicity and cultural up there. Once the Reformation happens and then Protestantism, they try to force the Irish to become Protestant, then it becomes even worse because the Irish decide that they're not going to give up their religion and that they'd rather die than be Protestant. So the true Irish are the Irish Catholics. So if you're an Irish Protestant, then to a certain extent, you're a traitor. It's much more complicated than that, but this creates an even worse sectional strife. And we will be talking about in the Civil War about sectional strife. Sectional strife in the United States becomes, you're from the North, you're pro business and independence and anti-slavery, and there's bigger population and you have a bigger economy. You're from the South, there's plantations, it's an agrarian society. There's lots of plantation owners, there's lots of farms and cash crops like cotton and sugar and coffee, not so much coffee, but tobacco and indigo. You're growing all these things and you're pro-slavery because that's who's doing the work to make your economy grow. So this creates a section of pro-slavery southern states and a section of industrialized anti-slavery northern states. So there's a couple pages there for you to read about Ireland. It's just about the dress rehearsal for Empire. You can read that over yourself. The next part of the textbook is going to talk about how the Industrial Revolution gets going. And I believe I'm going to make this a very short lecture today because, again, I don't want anybody getting confused about what's on the quiz and what's not. But the next section in 156 is called The Rise of the Machine. And this is just, I borrowed this expression because it sounds like a science fiction movie like The Terminator or The Matrix or iRobot or something like that. Like the rise of the machine is when the machines take over, right? There was a kind of fear like that more so that people would lose their jobs, and not that the machines themselves would kill them, but um, the machines back then were enormous and heavy and dangerous. There was very little safety precautions made. People were not wearing hard helmets or steel toe boots, or protective clothing so that it won't burn, and all the gears and the pulleys and the sharp objects spinning, heavy metal things slamming down on the ground or in the plate to make those products. All those things are kind of unguarded. So like if you trip and fall and into one of the machines, there's no fail safe, it turns off automatically or anything. That's it. You lose your fingers or your arm or your leg or your hands, or you die, or you fall into a big huge container of acid for some for producing some product, and you fall into that, or glue, a big huge container of glue, and yeah, there's no guardrails to protect you from slipping and falling in. Once you are in there, then you're gone. So we have to talk about the Industrial Revolution in detail, because there's lots of things to talk about. But basically, in the 18th century, there became these conditions for the United Kingdom to take advantage of the technology that they were using. They had some problems that they had to overcome in their economy. England is a pretty well located place geography, but it's not especially well endowed with resources. So they have coal, but the coal isn't very easy to get to. So they had to basically invent a machine to kind of pump the water out of the ground so that they could access the coal. They had to come up with some technological means of mining this coal, and one thing led to another until they started realizing that we could use this steam powered machine or these pumps and stuff, and we could make a track, and then we could move, instead of pulling the stuff by horse, we could put this cart on a track, and if we powered it with some other power source other than an animal, we would be able to push it. The energy from the engine that you created, the power of the steam, would be able to push a large amount of material down a track. And that's where the original start of the steam engine and the train was. Well, it's from English and Scottish people trying to figure out how to get things out of the earth and how to pump water out of places they didn't want it to be. Of course, even before that, there was a huge demand for wool. The main commodity coming out of England for much of its history was wool, and then they started to be able to grow cotton. They grew cotton in the United States. They found it grew very well in the South, and they imported slaves in order to produce that cotton, and that cotton was sent across the ocean to the cotton mills, and at the cotton mills, there would be people, what do you call it, spinning the cloth, spinning the cotton into cloth. In the past, that job was done at home. It was a cottage industry, and often it was mothers. There was women who would be spinning the cloth, a spinning wheel, and it was fine wool, and it was a huge source of income. The wool industry and wool production, fine wool production, was very important to England, but it started to lose. The market was shrinking for that. And obviously, once they started exploring across the world and they tried to sell wool clothing to people in Africa and India, wool is not especially suited for tropical climates, so they didn't really want to trade for clothing that was warm and soft and warm and thick, because that would be a horrible thing to wear in the jungle, I guess, or in a desert, or on in a grassland where you're exposed by the sun. You know, when you see the type of things that people wear when they're in the Serengeti, is they wear very little because it's too hot. This wool, which had been the main stable product for England for hundreds and hundreds of years, started to lose its market share. And as a consequence, I said, around Shakespeare's time and in the 17th century, there was a lot of unemployment, and this was a big problem. So another reason for them to expand this empire is to get rid of these people who aren't working, send them to the Americas where they can work, and once they're working there and producing valuable resources and commodities, they could be sent back to the home country, and then they could be turned into manufactured goods, like tobacco can be turned into cigars, and cotton can be turned into cloth and clothing and sheets and curtains and everything else. And so once they had that system going, suddenly there wasn't so many beggars and unemployed people walking around, but still there wasn't enough labor. They just didn't have enough people to produce enough for the demand for cotton. So an inventor came up with something called a spinning jenny, which just basically allowed one person to spin 5 times as much. There was, instead of one spool coming off a line of cotton, there was 5, so the spinning jenny. And they started just with that, but the productivity is multiplying, right? So instead of getting one person's labor, you get 500% from each person. So you produce an exponential number higher of all these things. Obviously, there was a limit to how much cloth they could make, but the limit was way, way beyond what their capacity could do. So that drove the textile industry, drove the desire to improve the machines, build stronger machines, and find better power sources so that the cotton industry could meet the demand. That's why the price of cotton was so high at first, but the cost of producing it and its sale price dropped over the next 100 years. It dropped. The numbers are ridiculous, like 100 times less. I guess it would be 10,000%. Cotton was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Cotton was a very expensive fabric that only rich people would wear. And after the Industrial Revolution had run its course, everybody was wearing cotton. Sugar is also something like that too. I hadn't mentioned that either. But we all take sugar for granted. It's in everything. All of our food has some sugar in it. It's very hard to get anything that doesn't have sugar in it. And if it doesn't have sugar, usually it's a soft drink that says 0 calories, 0 sugar on it. But these are special products that have no sugar. But otherwise, we're using billions of tons of sugar. You imagine how much sugar was worth when there was only 100 kilograms of sugar coming across the ocean the first time. That is why we called sugar white gold, because only the very wealthiest people would be able to eat sugar and have sugar in their tea or flavor their food with it. But the demand was so high for it that we created more and more sugar until finally we have an overabundance in sugar, probably too much. As far as I can see, there's candy all over the place. Everybody's teeth are bad, and kids are eating lollipops all the time. It's really, we've overdone it now. But anyway, originally sugar was white gold. So some of these commodities are really important. This is what we're going to talk about on Friday. And as I said, we have a quiz. So I'm sure people aren't going to, focus on this lecture too much. I'll extend this lecture until after the quiz, so you have time to watch it after the quiz if you want. But listen carefully to what I said. These are the major points. We got to talk about We just talked about imperialism today, but another big one, we're just starting industrialization, and we have to talk about the American Civil War. And that's the plan for Friday after we do the quiz. Thank you for listening as always. And I apologize, I've got a cold, so I was sniffling, but it should be better by Friday. Have a good week.